is Jesse Beaumont. I work for ShinobiControl. Some of you may have seen our stuff at the booth or heard about us in the keynote. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how mobile in particular impacts real-time decision-making and what we can do in terms of visualization and other things to kind of capitalize on that. And when I was kind of pondering this particular presentation title, I thought the place to start was maybe to talk about what a decision is and, you know, a little bit of context around that. And I thought I'd spare you the cliched definition slide, you know, of what a decision is, because you probably know that. But for anybody that doesn't, I would say it's a resolution reached after a period of consideration, right? So, and the difference, I guess, in terms of real time versus not real time is trying to keep that period of consideration to a minimum. But if we take a step back and think about why do we make decisions? Well, really, they're a way to drive a course of action towards our goals. Okay, so they're trying to achieve something. And in the context of what most of us do for a living, those goals tend to be business goals, right? Maximizing revenue or deciding which markets, you know, getting our market strategy right or whatever it is. We're basically going towards goals. Now, again, that's not rocket science. Everybody can probably figure that out. But actually, one thing that is worth pointing out is that the quality of a decision is not how you made it. It's what happened when you made it, right? You took the action. Was it a good action or not? And that's how you then qualify whether it was a good decision or not. It's not the decision itself. It's the outcome of the action. And by way of kind of demonstration of that, an example is that I've decided to buy that car. Now, this is the Bugatti Veyron, if you don't know. The motor, the engine generates about 1,000 brake horsepower. It tops out at 268 miles per hour. It looks awesome. I want one. I think if I looked around, I could probably find plenty of people that would agree with me that that's a great decision. You know, I gotta have that car. Except that if I actually then took the action of buying it, I'd be $2 million overdrawn. I wouldn't have any money to afford the insurance. I couldn't pay for gas. And to kind of top it all off, when I got it home, if I got it home, I can't get it over the stupid speed bumps in my road. So I can't actually get it home. So basically, I think, you know, the point there, although it's rather silly, is that the outcome had nothing to do with the quality of the decision as I thought of it initially, right? It was a really bad choice. And that's important in terms of what we're thinking about here, because decisions aren't deterministic. Okay, you have to, all you can do is try and stack the odds in your favor. All right, it's all about trying to get the best possible outcome in terms of probabilities of trying to get to where you want to go. And the way you do that in any kind of risk management scenario is try and get as much evidence as you can. And that's really where we start to kind of get interesting is how do you get the data to people to make their informed decisions as much as possible. And there's, you know, I mean, you will be able to think of plenty of kind of context for real-time decision-making, be it medical or stocks or betting odds or data center metrics or, you know, anything else. I mean, it's throughout business is real-time decision-making. But the thing here is that real-time decision-making requires real-time data. Okay, so if you're going to drive those decisions from data, you need the up-to-date data, because there's no good buying a stock today based on yesterday's price. That's not going to help you. So what does that mean? Well, let's take a step sideways first and think about what is mobile. Okay, because that's the other big part of what we're talking about here. So I think we can all agree that that's mobile. Yep, these guys, and we can probably all agree that that's mobile. What about these guys? Are they mobile? Ultrabooks, the MacBook Air? Maybe, possibly. What about that guy? Laptop? Yeah, possibly. There's an argument to say it is. There's an argument to say it isn't. Yeah, probably not. If you think that's mobile, this is the wrong conference for you. Okay. As far as we're concerned, I'm going to focus on the far end of that, and there's a particular reason for that, and we'll come to that in a second. But I think a lot of what I'm saying today probably applies to a decreasing degree across the whole spectrum, right? Until you get to your servers, that's probably less interesting. So what's made the mobile revolution possible? You know, what is the mobile revolution? Well, we all have mobile phones now. Everybody's got a smartphone. In the UK, 80% of the population has a smartphone. That's staggering numbers, okay? But what's done that? Well, okay, so we can all agree that mobile things are portable, right? Otherwise, it's a terrible, terrible misnomer. I think they're all connected, right? So everybody expects their mobile device to have internet access now. That's part of what a mobile unit is. Yeah. Instant access, you can immediately turn it on and use it. That's really important. Now, I put a question mark against it because maybe you disagree, but I think we'll come back and have a look at that in terms of how that impacts what we do. Personalized, okay, as Nat was saying in the keynote, if you were there, he was talking about them being an extension of us rather than an extension of what we're doing, right? So they're part of us, and they live with us, they move with us. And that has an impact on how people use them, which has an impact on what we're trying to do. They're touch-enabled. Again, does that really matter? Is that important? Well, in terms of what we're achieving by empowering people to make decisions, it's very important, and we'll come back to how in a little bit. So I would argue that mobile has changed the world. Okay, I think probably all of you would agree if you thought about it, but in particular, we've got great-grandmothers of royal descent using mobiles. We've got babies using mobile devices, and the obligatory cats using mobiles. Everybody is okay with this. Everybody likes using mobile devices. Everybody's happy to do it. Why is that? Well, if any of you, like me, were the kind of local tech support guy for friends and family, you would have heard statements like, I don't know what it did, it just disappeared, or I wasn't sure what I wanted to, I didn't want to break it. Now, if you've ever tried to break a computer without kicking it, it's pretty hard, right? I mean, it's hard to write code that breaks a computer physically. So what was that? It was fear. It's technophobia, right? They didn't know what the outcome was. They didn't understand how it works. They were afraid to interact with it. But that's gone. There's a lower barrier to entry. Everybody knows how to use a tablet. Everybody's happy to poke a screen. The fear factor's gone, partially because of the personalization, right? Everybody has their own device. It's theirs. They don't have to worry about breaking somebody else's device. They know how it works. It's set up. They're comfortable with it. They know the kind of workflows that they are comfortable using. Massive thing. The end user experience, as a result, feels safe to them. They're happy to go and explore. Everybody is a mobile explorer now. Yeah. It's not about, I need to know how to do this in advance of doing it. It's about finding out how you do it. You just start touching stuff. You just start playing. And that completely changes the way in which we present our information to them and how we build user interfaces to satisfy their needs, because their needs are changing. But as Uncle Ben says to Peter Parker, with great power comes great responsibility. And unfortunately, in this scenario, we're Peter Parker, so we have to live up to people's expectations, right? They're going to have different sets of expectations than they used to have compared to desktops and world of old. And that is largely driven by the user experience that they've come to expect through the whole genesis of the mobile revolution, right? The iPhone changed everything. People didn't have to understand all of the detail. They didn't have to know what a USB hub was in their device manager. That didn't matter. They don't even need to know where it stored files. They don't need to know what a C drive is. But people now have expectations, right? Constant availability. We all know that if the internet access goes off on your phone, it's like torture, right? You have to have internet access, like you can't live without your email for 5 minutes. Immediate response to touch, this is a big thing. So the actual physical sensation of touching a screen gives you a different expectation from using a mouse. You're physically connected to it, and if you drag your finger and the user interface doesn't follow, it feels really bad and weird. Okay, that's not true of a mouse. If you drag a mouse and it lags behind it, that's fine. Nobody really cares. Intuitive behavior is a huge one, right? People nowadays people vote with their feet. So if you start using an app and you don't understand how it works, you just stop using it. You won't put up with it. Especially in enterprise worlds, that didn't used to be the case. You just you had to put up with whatever tools they gave you. Now people they rebel. And I've seen it happen. You speak to users and they say, I don't want to use that. I'll go back to the desktop system in preference to using something that's with them. So this intuitive behavior thing is crucial. So let's go back to this. So how does mobile help in terms of what we're doing? Well, okay, portable. We need to make decisions wherever we are, especially if the real-time decisions, we don't have time to wait for getting back to our desks or being in a convenient location. We have to make them wherever they are. Okay, so that's portable. Connected, we've said, in order to have real-time decisions, you need to have real-time data, you need to have up-to-date data, and that means you need to get that data to wherever people are with their mobile devices, so they need to be connected. Instant access, same thing. You don't want to wait. When I come into the office in the morning, I boot up my machine, and then I go and make a cup of coffee. Now, if I want to make real-time decisions, I can't wait for a cup of coffee. I don't want to wait for a cup of coffee. I want to pull my phone out and use it, right? So instant access is key. Personalization, I think, in terms of the user behavior and user expectations, that's made a huge difference. So the way people are willing to use their devices is all down to them being personalized to themselves. So that's helping. And the touch-enabled, like I said, there's this physical sensation thing where there's an expectation, but also a willingness to just manipulate the user interface by touch, much more so than by clicking with the mouse. And they're also partially because of the instant reaction. So you start touching things and see what happens. So all of those things are helping. So that's kind of some of the ways in which mobile is going to help us do this. But I wanted to kind of take that one step further. And in 1710, a guy called Dr. John Arbuthnot presented a paper about birth rates, and he was comparing ratios of males to females, and he was trying to see if there's some correlation there. And in those days, this was how you presented data. You had a big pile of numbers, and you wrote them down. And that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. And if we inspect that, we can kind of see that, okay, there in 1629, there was, lower numbers than in 1710, and that's fine. And maybe if you're, dedicated, you can find some peaks and some troughs and mins and maxes. But that's kind of it, okay? And this is where data visualization starts to come into the picture. Because if we plot that as a chart, okay, now we can see a lot more information at a glance, right? We can understand, okay, yes, there's definitely an upward trend. We can say that in all cases, there's more males than females, okay, by a small margin, although they seem to correlate very closely together. We now know that it's about, 51.6 or so to 48.4, whatever, And then we start to see some of these kind of peaks and troughs. And if we do a little bit of analysis, we can go and see, well, okay, so, right, so that's the Civil War. That explains why there was a big drop-off there, because people were all fighting wars rather than enjoying the pleasures of recreation. Reproduction, rather. So then there was a plague here. Yeah, that's gonna be a little bit of a bummer, so they didn't want to do that. Smallpox, yep, that explains that one. I don't know, can't find anything. So what the heck is that? Now, from the data table, we couldn't even see that thing was there easily, right? We couldn't even spot that there was any sort of problem. But we can't explain that trough, and if you go through the history books, you're not going to find anything significant that explains it. So then we can start to look at things like this. So we can say, okay, let's draw some numbers, and if you look closely, you can see that it actually goes through the same two data points over here. But that might just be, presentation. It might be pixels off. It might be anti-aliasing. So at this point, this is where the data table makes a lot more sense, okay? Because now we've done our kind of high-level visualization. We get kind of the trends, the concepts, the basic picture. There's a lot of context there. We've got a rough idea of what's going on. Now we can go back to the basic table, and we can see that actually this might be the first copy and paste error. All it was the guy made a clerical error, and he transposed the wrong values, right? Now, you never would have spotted that. He didn't spot it, right? But it's probably no coincidence that he repeated the same two values exactly, right? So that's basically, in a nutshell, data visualization for you, okay? Why do we do it? Well, it's basically designed to make data and numbers easier to understand, okay? Give you a very quick path to some basic information about it. It's making it easier to digest. It also provides a lot more context about the data. So you can start to see shapes and relationships, correlations. And as we've already discussed, that sounds like right up our street for real-time decision making, right? So we want real-time data. We want to make the decisions quickly. We need to digest the data quickly. Data visualization is at least a large part of the answer. So data visualization really falls along a spectrum. There's lots of different kinds. You will have seen many of them. But essentially, you can place different forms of it on this kind of spectrum from presentation to exploration. And there's almost an inverse scale of high skills requirements to low skills requirements to high skills requirements in terms of the user's ability to digest that information. So how much skill do you need in order to be able to interpret it? So if we take a look at some examples, at that end we have the newspaper, right? You've got your chart printed in the paper. That's great. Some editor has decided that's how they want to show the data to you. That's the point they want to make. But if they didn't show the point that you want to make, or that you want to understand, or you have a different question than the one they were trying to answer, tough luck. You're stuck, right? You can't see for this chart, stock price, say, what happened the 3 months previous, or the year previous, if they decided not to show it to you. Okay, so then next one down, we've got the kind of infamous infographic, which is becoming more and more popular. It's pretty much the same thing as the newspaper, except that generally with infographics, they'll try and slice and dice the data in different ways, right? So they'll show you, how many trees it took to print all the copies in the world of Lord of the Rings, and then they'll show you how many trucks it took to ship it around the world, and all of that stuff. So you get kind of different views on the same data, but principally some editor or graphic designer has decided how to show it to you and what to show you. You're stuck. Going further down, you get things like Google Analytics and other analysis tools where you get a certain amount of data and you get a certain amount of pre-canned ways of visualizing it, and you can explore it and slice and dice it to a certain degree, right? Then I would argue is like the classic spreadsheet, right? You have the data and you decide how to visualize it, but there's some kind of built-in tools. They're just more powerful, more flexible at least than the previous category of stuff. And then there's arguably the old-fashioned database where you get the raw data and then it's up to you to do the rest. So in terms of skills, well, as long as you can read a newspaper. And similarly with an infographic, well, Google Analytics, if you start to actually try and use that seriously, that takes some skill. You need to start to understand what they do and what the data means and how they're using it. And they don't always make it easy because like their y-axis scales are weird and it doesn't show you stuff like that. So Excel spreadsheets or OpenOffice or whatever you're using, that starts to get even more complicated. You need to start to understand how to build formulae and how to do charts and all this stuff. And then the database, obviously, you need to start to learn to program or at least use some sort of query tool and visualize the data in charts and in tables, and then you need some charting tool to, So that gets really complicated quite quickly. Now, what mobile does is that it moves the spectrum. It moves the population further towards the exploration end of the spectrum. People are much more willing now to play with tools, more powerful tools, more capable tools in terms of answering the questions they have themselves rather than having pre-canned visualizations ready-made. And that's all basically down to this notion that users are much more willing to explore in general on these devices. And that's really powerful for us. Okay, that means we can do an awful lot more stuff without affecting the ability for people to understand what we're doing. So, in terms of real-time data visualization, yeah, so we need to quickly make decisions, which means we need to have data visualization in the first place. We've made that argument. But it's really important to understand that poor visualizations are counterproductive. They either lead to poor decisions or slow decisions. Either you need to spend a lot of time understanding the data in order to make your decision because the visualization was counterproductive. It answered the wrong question, or it didn't make effective use of the techniques, or it just gives you the wrong answer. So at this point, I wanted to kind of step into some more practical stuff because you guys want to take something away with you. And the thought that I could try and cover everything in the data visualization field in 30 minutes is probably unrealistic. There's lots of good books on the topic, so if you want information on that, by all means, let me know. But I thought I'd kind of pick off some big ones, just some kind of big trouble spots, and look at some basics on how we might tackle those. So we've got information overload. You've got too much information to show on a screen, right? And the first thing to notice is that form factor is a factor, okay? It makes a difference how big your screen is. Now that might sound sensible or intuitive or obvious even, but I think there's some specific things we can say about it, right? So smaller screens, you require to be more focused. You have to really pare down what it is you're trying to tell your user much more diligently than you would on a larger screen. The user journeys, the story the user goes through in order to get to their answer has to be much shorter. You have to be a lot more rigid because, for simple reasons, one of which is that user interactions obscure most of the screen on a small screen, right? So you're physically hiding what it is the user's trying to see. So you want to kind of minimize that and have fewer of those. But also just the amount of time people interact with their mobile phone is very different from the amount of time they interact with their tablets. Often mobile phones are on the move. You only have a couple of seconds for them to get to the answer. So that generally means you have to answer simpler questions or you have to make some assumptions, which is fine. Larger screens, on the other hand, are better for exploration. And what you'll find more and more nowadays is cross-device type usages. Yeah, the Evernotes of the world, where you do something on one device in a certain way, and then you come back to it on another device. You bookmark something over here to read it on your tablet later. You download the movie to show it on your TV later. All of that sort of stuff is really starting to come to life now. But I should point out that focusing your information is not a bad thing. That's actually a very positive thing to be doing because it forces you to think about what it is you're actually trying to tell your users. But by way of example, here's a weather app. Okay, so on this one I can show you the days of the week and cloud coverage and wind speeds and temperatures and humidity and all that stuff over time. Okay, but maybe you're not a sailor, so on your phone you could maybe just pare it down to, okay, likelihood of rain, temperature, that's probably fine. Or if you're really keen, you just, do I need an umbrella or not? Yep. Which, maybe that's the question people are asking, which is fine. So I think that's a good example of what you can do on different screen sizes and how focusing the information is actually not a bad thing, right? Because if the umbrella question is the one people want answered, they don't want to parse all of that other information about, the weather on Friday because they don't care. So that's that one. Kind of a corollary to that is the one where you don't have enough pixels. You're just running out of space. So what do? Well, minimize Chrome is probably the obvious one. Get rid of extraneous buttons and graphics and stuff. Now I say minimize because you need some Chrome, right? There's got to be some sort of stuff around the outside to tell people, give people context, and make it obvious because discoverability is a real problem. If you start to embed your navigation, you get your pinch zooms and your gestures and stuff, how do people find out about it, right? So then you need some explanatory stuff or some hints or something going on. So you're going to need some help, right? So it's not a case of getting rid of it altogether, but that's one way you can save a lot of pixels, right? Get rid of the drop shadows and the rounded corners. And semantic zoom is a great one. So as the user drills into a particular feature or information set, show more of it, right? So that's a great use. And be focused. We've said this before, but don't try and do too much on a screen. If you find that you don't have enough pixels, chances are you're trying to put too much information on the screen, split it over multiple screens, make the user make a decision earlier, something like that. So by way of example for this, so this is from our Play app. Basically, this is a chart, right? And if I pinch zoom, I can drill in, and then I start to see extra annotations on the chart, right? So there's a perfect example of you get the basic picture of the chart, get the shape and stuff. Oh, this bit looks interesting. Zoom into that, and you start to get annotations and more decorative information, right? Which is quite cool. And of course, we've embedded the navigation into the chart. There's no zoom buttons here. It's a pinch zoom. It's a gesture. It's kind of intuitive to people who use Google Maps and all of those sorts of things. Who let the designers out? This is a one I like a lot because you'll send your graphic designer off to say, yeah, I want to build a user interface, and it's got to do all these cool things, and they'll come with a beautiful application. I mean, it'll have bells and whistles all over the drop shadows, gradients, and all this cool stuff. And that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that, but it's worth noting, in particular, how those things can help you, right? Because they do provide a natural feel. If you're on iOS and you don't have gradients, it looks weird. If you have an iOS app and you just do the content first, modern UI, Windowsy thing, people will kind of feel out of place, and that's kind of weird. Also, things like momentum I would put into this, and animations, they've got to feel natural. They help kind of give it some texture. And especially with our charts, we watch people when we were doing the animations for momentum and swipes and stuff. We would watch people use them before we got them right, and you would get this frown on their face, and you could see that they weren't enjoying the experience, and they didn't know why, and it took us, tweaking lots of little settings here and there to get it right until they stopped frowning, basically. Yeah. It helps meet expectations, right? And we've talked about, if you're on an iOS device, it's got to look like an iOS thing, because otherwise you're kind of out of a different, in a different mindset all of a sudden, you're kind of disoriented. It aids discoverability, right? If you've got a little animation that bounces in, it shows you that there's maybe something off screen, or you might just grow your chart in the case of a chart, to show that actually it's an interactive thing. You can actually play with this. It's not a static picture. So there's that kind of aspect to it, but be careful. So there's a good example of that, right? So you can, that automatically shows you that there's something underneath, right? You can peel that back, which is a good little effect. It really can detract from the content, though. If all of your stuff is bouncing all over the place, and the user can't follow it, and all of this stuff, it can be pretty disorienting and not a pleasant experience. So in terms of an example, let's take charts, because I like charts. And we're talking about data visualization. So here's a cool chart, right? It's what I like to call a 2.5D chart. It's not got a proper Z-axis, but people like to call these 3D charts. But anyway, and it's a bar chart, and it's got these cool gradient effects, right, and rounded tops, and that's all very pretty. But actually, if you look at the data, it's kind of hard to read. I would say that first column there, what's that, about 4,800 maybe, something like that. Okay, so let's make it easier to read the chart, because that's what we're about, right? We're trying to get people to read the data. So let's just pare it right down, and if this is the same data, it's not 4,800, it's 5,000. That's a perspective problem that Excel likes to do, okay? And that's like a big no-no in data visualization, is showing the wrong data. That's got to be probably, rule number one, don't do that. Okay, now this, fine. Okay, so now I can read the chart. I can read off the values. I can compare them more easily. But it's kind of ugly, right? So it's not about paring it right down to be ugly. Now, if you've listened to Edward Tufte, he's probably kind of more along these lines. He's going to tell you to pare it down, get rid of all non-data ink. He'd probably get rid of the grid lines as well, just to really get it right and simple. He likes to do a little L shape rather than a whole bar, because you don't need that extra line. That's not telling you anything, which is fine. In terms of raw data, that's true. Get right down to the basics. But my argument is that the first task of data visualization is to get people to look at the data, and I don't want to look at that. Okay, now, so that's where kind of prettiness comes up. But you can make it pretty without detracting from the data. So we can do stuff like color in the bars and have a subtle gradient, and drop shadows behind the chart where it doesn't detract so much. All sorts of stuff we can do, as long as you don't detract from the data. All right, and there's, again, loads of materials on what the limits are and what detracts and what doesn't. And examples are, put your gradients across the bar charts rather than top to bottom, because if you put them top to bottom, it actually affects the way you perceive the data, right, at the top if it's lighter. So there's lots of stuff there. Another common one is, which chart do we use? Yeah, there's tons of chart types, and it would be ludicrous for me to try and explain them all here, or try and even cover which to use when. I mean, that's just useless. Again, there's loads of books. A personal favorite of mine in terms of general data visualization is Stephen Few's book, Show Me the Numbers. Great book, yeah, in terms of just understanding what it is you should look out for. That's a good one to read. But I thought I'd pick one out in particular that is a bugbear of mine, which is the old pie chart, right? Now, I should point out before I launch into this tirade that actually pie charts are one of our most popular charts, right? People like them because they're pretty, which is fine. Like we said, first obstacle is getting people to look at it in the first place. But pies are okay if what you're trying to show is that all of the data kind of combines to make a whole. If that's your point, that's fine. That pie is good for that. And pies are good for showing that one thing is dominant. Yeah, you can show that, yeah, this particular category is the dominant factor here. Anything beyond that, and you're wasting your time, right? Pie charts are really hard to read in terms of data values, trying to get, I mean, if you looked at kind of angles and you're trying to figure out, right, is that, 70% or 60% or 65%, it's very hard to do. And it's very hard to compare pie slices. So as soon as you get into oh, well, here's the breakdown of the market by segment, or the mobile OS market share. It starts to lose value. So here's a good example of that, right? So here's sales by country, some fictitious data. I can see, yep, USA is our biggest market. Great. So that tells me some good stuff. I can't see how much bigger is it than Australia. No idea. Now, obviously, you could put labels on there, and you'll see most pie charts do, right? You could put the data values on the pie chart. But then why are you using a chart? What's the chart doing for you? If you're just showing the values, just put it in a table, right? It's easier to read. You don't have to worry about conflicting labels and collision detection and all that stuff, right? If I plot the same stuff as a column chart, now I can start to read actual values off it. Not exact ones, but I can kind of guesstimate. I can say, right, okay, so the USA is actually 230,000 units-ish, and it's maybe 4 times as big as the UK. So I can start to make some rough approximations about the data. That's fine. But if my point was that the USA is the biggest, and that's kind of what I'm trying to get across, that's great. Yeah, that's fine. The pie chart's perfectly adequate for doing that. And it's actually not a bad tool, because now, if you go for the column chart, then you're starting to ask the user to start to compare values, right? You're inviting them to do more. So for presentations and things like that, the pie chart's pretty good. But we could make it better. We could, for instance, start to use color to make things stand out. If the point is that the USA is the biggest one, get people to look at the USA, right? Which kind of brings me on to the next thing, which is color. Color choice is important, right? Color tells people a lot about the data they're looking at. And there's some basic kind of rules of thumb, if you like. The first thing I would say is look at accessibility and mediums, right? Are you catering for colorblind people? Are you going to have to print this stuff? Is it going just on your iPad, or is it going on the web as well? Do you need to use web-safe colors? All of that kind of stuff kind of factors into it, which is good. So you can increase the saturation to stand out. Now, this is a really good one. We just showed that in basic principle. But if what you're trying to do is draw attention to a particular value, using color is a great way to do that, okay? But if you use the kind of gaudy, super bright colors, you've got nowhere to go. You've got no way to focus, and then you're into kind of drawing boxes around things, or pointing arrows at the stuff you like, which is all just detracting from the actual data again. Oh, sorry. Considering avoiding biased colors. So if all you have is 2 columns and you have them red and green, people will make assumptions about what that means. Yeah, red is good, green is bad. Or in some cultures, it's the reverse. So then you're just confusing people. So it's worth considering those. I'm not saying don't use red and green. I'm just saying, think about it before you do. If it is good and bad, then maybe you do want to use red and green, for example. But I think the key thing here is that colors are a really important tool for getting the message across. The colors themselves have meaning, so it's worth kind of factoring that into your visualization design. Again, as an example, here's some data. So here's our website load stuff, right? We might want to draw attention to that crazy big bar, right? Something's going wrong there. I can just make that stand out. See how that pops out now? I mean, now if I had made them all the bright orange, I've got nowhere to go, and I could make it kind of faded, but then that's kind of all counterintuitive. You're sort of saying it's less interesting. So that's something to consider. In terms of conclusions, obviously this has kind of been a whistle-stop tour. There's a lot of information here, but I think mobile offers a huge opportunity for us, right? We can start to empower users to make their own decisions by giving them the data and letting them explore and answer their own questions. And that means we don't have to pre-answer questions, which means we don't have to know what the questions are in the first place in many cases, right? We've got the data, we give them some tools and let them find their way. Super powerful. But it takes a lot of thought. Okay, you really have to know what you're doing, and you have to have care and attention, because the details can be really detracting. If you do the wrong thing, you're going to screw it up for them. So just be aware that this stuff needs thinking about, and you need to really spend some time on it. This is the sales plug, sorry. But we spend a lot of time doing exactly that, right? So we've tried to build some tools that make it easier for you guys to do that stuff. So by all means, do check our controls out, right? They all have Xamarin bindings, so we do charts, grids, and lots of user interface controls that try and solve some of these problems and make it easier for you, so you don't have to do all of the work yourself. So that's me. Thanks a lot for listening. If you have questions, I'm more than happy to take some. Yes?
I had a question on title prominence, especially in the
Oh, yeah.
The one that started out playing.
Oh. Way back here.
This one.
This one?
Yeah, so on this one, I found in a lot of information that sometimes playing with the decreased prominence of HTTP requests and website load distribution, but increasing the prominence of the 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, 4,000, and then the servers, that helped to make the data more readable
Absolutely.
as opposed to making it more glanceable,
Yeah,
right?
yeah. So, yeah.
You're not advertising a movie, you're advertising the data.
I agree, yep, yeah. As long as, but I think it's worth remembering that those titles convey information too. They convey data, right? So, you know, if we take those titles away altogether, you don't know what you're looking at. Yeah, sure. No, I would agree. Absolutely, yep, definitely. No, I think that's really valid. You know, the kind of visualization theory typically says get rid of non-data ink, right? So if it's not conveying data, just drop it. There's arguments for and against, but I think that's a case of that, right? So you're trying to kind of at least reduce the prominence of the kind of lesser data ink, you know. So I think that's very valid. Whether it visually looks right, you know, if your title's really small and your logo, you know, your access labels are really big, that's another question. But you know, it's probably a balance issue. Yeah, yeah. So I quite frequently, I can't remember if I did that. It didn't come out very well, but so these are kind of gray rather than black. So you know, that's kind of, so I did that for the title and the, you know, so I think it's just. But yeah, no, I agree. Yeah, absolutely. Anything else? Yes.
How with the support for monotouch and all the Xamarin tools that Shinobi's now got, how much is there a lot of resources in Beaumont developer tutorials, information, things like that? Like,
Yeah.
I looked at the sites and it's like you got the bindings and stuff. But
Yeah.
not a whole lot more beyond that.
Yeah, yeah. So I mean, we're on a journey there, right? The first step was to build the Shinobi developer section, right, which is kind of our forums and tutorials and so. And we've got a massive backlog of work to do there. But yeah, definitely we want to put more work into the Xamarin kind of tooling and documentation and examples and stuff. The other thing we're starting to look at is, I mean, you know, if you guys have a view on this, we're starting to think about doing like code snippets and contrib libraries and, you know, all of that kind of stuff, if that's stuff you would use, you know, in terms of maybe GitHub or, you know, something along those lines.
Yeah, like we did a quick spike last night and we got the Shinobi trial and we threw it into our app. Cool, but it's kind of like, okay.
Yeah, what else? Yeah.
Trying to discoverability on where to go from here kind of thing.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So,
our Objective-C guys, so it's not like we can look at those and say, oh, okay.
yeah. Yeah, so we do try and do some of that. There's some stuff on our blogs already. There's like some getting started guides and stuff, but yeah, we need to definitely something on our radar. Anyone else? Yep.
There's a lot of discussion about like the new pattern. Actually, the old pattern got introduced to the iOS called MVVM. So
Yeah.
I don't know whether Shinobi trying to embrace that pattern.
Yeah, so I mean, we're well aware of the kind of .NET MVVM thing. A lot of it is kind of based on data bindings, right? So you kind of got to cross that hurdle first, which MVVM cross, I guess, kind of starts to address. But because ours is an Objective-C native library and then Xamarin wrapped around the outside, so we're limited a little bit in terms of what we can do at the moment. But we're definitely, I'm really keen to do more data binding stuff even in the Objective-C version. I want to introduce a data binding library because it's such a cool concept. You know, it makes life easier.
I have background in Silverlion, like using Xamarin to do a UI customization. It's pretty easy by doing like template, data template, and all kinds of stuff. I wonder like how easy or what is the best practice to do UI customization for on top of the Shinobi.
Yeah, so I mean, it depends a little bit on what controls you're using, right? So charts, because we're hardware accelerated, there's less flexibility in terms of what you can do in terms of styling. But all of our controls have a theming concept, so it's all exposed as styles in the same way as Silverlight has kind of style objects, you know, getters and setters. Similar concept built into all of our controls. So you know, fonts and colors and gradients and borders and all that stuff is there for you to customize. In terms of data templating or even just control templating like you have in Silverlight or other XAML tools, Obviously, the functionality is not there under the hood to do that. But what we are starting to think about is better tools for styling in general for iOS apps. So that's something that we're investigating. Yep. Anyone else? Any more for any more?
What do you make of the current uptake of people designing for camera-based gesture controls on mobile devices?
I think, so you mean like for recording it, or?
For using just in a similar way to Connect, only people trying to.
Oh, right, gotcha. Yeah. Motion control type stuff. Yeah, no, I think that's very cool. I mean, I think there's a lot of future in that, and I think especially because the devices have so much kind of built-in capability now in terms of accelerometers and GPS and all of that stuff. Even doing gestures with the device, physical gestures, I think that's starting to pay dividends. I think there's a long way to go though in terms of making it really usable. Even Connect, I find, at times it's awkward, you're standing there doing these kinds of things. And I was at a conference and some guys had built a banking app that was motion enabled. And it was kind of a demo piece for them, to get people into their booth. But they spent the entire time going, and it would only work like 2/3 of the time. So then you have these little dances going on in front of you, so I think there's a ways to go into making it a real nice user experience. But yeah, I mean I think it's definitely coming. So.
Have you dabbled much with the APIs that exist in devices that support that?
Not the camera-based stuff. No, we've done some of the built-in accelerometer type stuff, but not too much on the camera-based stuff. Yep.
You mentioned in the earlier slides about showing the wrong data
Mm-hmm.
can sometimes actually be completely opposite to what your objective is of helping them make
Yeah.
their decisions and quickly. Do you have any books that you recommend on actually doing the analysis of data and helping the user to dig down?
I think Stephen Few is probably so he has a website called Perceptual Edge, I think, and he's got some great tutorials that start out with one chart, and he kind of talks you through step by step turning that into the right chart. So it'll be like a bar chart of sales figures, right? And what you're actually trying to answer is the differential between that, and the previous month, year-on-year figures or something. So charting the actual figures is the wrong thing. You want to be charting the differential. And concepts like that. And he's got really great kind of step-by-step tutorials that kind of take you through the full chain of trying to rethink, how you present data, not just throw it out there and leave it to them.
What about the actual analysis and digging and finding the data that needs to be shown?
So you mean like statistical analysis and stuff?
Statistical analysis.
Yeah, I don't know offhand of any good books on that. Most of my knowledge in that area has been sort of just osmosis, I'm afraid, from years of doing SAS programming and stuff like that. I just kind of sucked that up somewhere. I don't know.
Okay.
So yeah, sorry, I don't know of any particular titles that I would point you at. But I can find out if you want to send me an email. I can certainly ask our, because we've got some data scientists and stuff that'll.
Yeah, so I've seen some stuff on Bloom filters and other ways to try to dig data out more
Yeah.
from the systems. And
Yeah.
it seems very relevant.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Anyone else? Any more questions? Nope. All right. Thanks, guys.